Way back in the day, I always remember two brothers in my apartment building who were the very first kids I knew to get the Nintendo Entertainment System. My brother and I would often go to their house to play Mario, WWF, Duck Hunt, and all the usual titles you think of. One thing about them though was that they would always get the new games. They had an NES collection vastly greater than any other kids in the building, and one such title I remember vividly playing was Excitebike. We all loved the simplicity, the arcade frantic nature of it, and the simple fact it played well, looked good, and even at that age has enough mastery in it to keep you coming back. Fast forward to the N64 era, and one thing I always loved about new consoles, and especially Nintendo's, is that they would often recycle their franchises. By the time of this game's release, many of us had already given up hope of Metroid 64, and so instead were left wondering what Nintendo would do with the final batch of their games on the system. Now, as much as I loved the original Excitebike, it wasn't one of the Nintendo IPs that I was waiting with bated breath for. In 1999, when Nintendo announced they were bringing back Excitebike, there were already some stellar racing titles on the system, and I just didn't feel much need to be in a rush to play it. Landing on store shelves in the year 2000 in North America and Japan, published by Nintendo but developed by Left Field Studios, Excitebike 64 is a nod to the series' origins with a smothering of that year 2000 teenage extreme attitude, which added yet another extreme sports title to the already crowded and congested genre in the gaming marketplace. Being handed such a well-known IP by Nintendo, Left Field Studios wanted to produce something truly worthy of the game's heritage, and so threw all they had at the title. The studio promised a large number of both indoor and outdoor tracks, insane stunts and tricks, licenses to give the game an authentic look and feel, and a track creator to offer everlasting enjoyment. The studio wanted to concentrate on three core elements which they felt were imperative to making this game a success. Firstly was the game's speed, secondly were the stunts, and finally it was following the game progression found in Wave Race 64. On paper this all sounded perfect, and when Nintendo made the game playable at E3 in 1999, initial impressions were generally positive. The core gameplay takes place in the season mode, where like most racing titles you'll have a series of tournaments or seasons to enter, and in order to unlock the more challenging series, you'll need to come first place at the end of the season. The game also features an exhibition mode and a time trial mode which are self-explanatory and on par for all other racing games. There are a series of additional special tracks which mix up the gameplay, and these include a soccer mode and also a hill climb, but I expect that most players invested their time in the stunt track with an aim of practicing and perfecting their moves and skills. The desert track mode is actually quite a cool concept. You're tasked with following waypoints to reach set destinations. Now this may not sound too exciting, but from a technical standpoint it is, because the actual tracks themselves are randomly generated in real time, but it remains in the system memory, meaning you can return to previous markers. With 20 courses contained in the game, it's no surprise that they get more technically challenging the further into the game you progress. The overall track design is excellent, and both the layout and placement of obstacles works well to keep the game flowing. What hampers this, however, is just how easy you're knocked off your bike. Every time an opponent is near you, you'll feel like you're in a 50-50 as to whether you'll get knocked off your bike or if your opponent will. This really takes away some enjoyment from the game, as you'll spend so much time getting back on your bike and needing to pick up the pace from a cold start. The rest of the game runs very smoothly and with little slowdown. The developers hit their target of gaining a sense of speed, but with this sensation being broken up so often when racing with collisions, going off the edge of the track or hitting an obstacle the wrong way, it can become frustratingly slow at times. The controls, however, are excellent. The entire game is simple to pick up and play, and like the original Excitebike, there's a great curve in your mastery of the handling. The many riders contained in the game all do handle and feel unique, and so you'll definitely need to spend some time trying to figure out which rider works for your preferred playstyle. Now, when recording for this review, I tried many of the playable characters, and while some were far too floaty in their cornering, I eventually found and settled on one which gave me just enough grip without handling like a tank. Graphically, the game is quite a looker, I think. When you compare this to, say, Jeremy McGrath's Supercross, it's a huge improvement. The game supports the expansion pack, and when high-res textures are enabled, you'll see the thicker bars around the screen and a slightly slower frame rate. For me personally, this is not a game which makes perfect use of the expansion pack, and the choppy nature of the game in the high-res mode makes this a no-go for me. And so I think that you are best sticking with the standard textures and a much more pleasant frame rate. To make the character models animate as realistically as possible, Left Field Studios used a technique called inverse kinematics, which is instantly noticeable as the actual riders themselves don't look stiff and glued to their seats. Both the texture quality and art style are really high quality, which is something I was personally expecting with the game coming from the same studio behind the NBA Courtside series. The game's audio department is fantastic from an effects perspective. Now, I'm not a biker by any means, but everything here sounds lifelike, realistic and very crisp. The music in the game is generic late 90s rock game music, which you'll have heard in many other games of this type over the years. It's not terrible here, but it doesn't do much to make you want to keep listening either. The announcer does become annoying, as his lines are definitely overused and go on far too long, resulting in him calling things way after they've actually happened. For many gamers though, the addition of the track creator would have been a welcome addition. It seems like games of this time always had to have some type of creation suite in them, and thankfully the create a track mode here is perhaps the easiest to use from its competitors. Within a matter of minutes you'll have mastered all you need to know in order to allow yourself to build some pretty impressive tracks and then be racing them for yourself. With enough sections, textures and space, I really can't fault this mode in any way. My biggest gripe with the game, however, comes from the overall lack of enjoyment I experienced whilst playing it. Everything in the game seems to have been done right, and yet it just doesn't seem to have the same fun factor as most other races. The rubber banding of the AI also doesn't help this, and despite there being many shortcuts to take, it lacks a lot of freedom I feel it really should have had in this type of game. This game should have welcomed exploration and actually going off and trying to find new shortcuts and routes, but as soon as you're out of bounds, you reset back onto the middle of the track. Now, from a European perspective, the launch was a disaster. The game arrived nearly a year after the North American and Japanese release due to Nintendo struggling to meet demand for other key titles such as Perfect Dark and Pokemon Stadium. Arriving here in Europe in the year 2001 meant that by this point there was next to no interest in this title, and people's attention had already moved on to the future of gaming. The reviews of the time though were generally positive, and no surprises that some of the first party publications or those with strong ties to Nintendo gave this game an almost perfect score. Criticisms from those who dared to face Nintendo's wrath included the game's mixed handling and lack of real riders. For me, however, despite knowing that this game is technically very good and definitely a very solid effort, it's not a game that I rushed back to that often. The studio wanted to surpass Wave Race as their benchmark, but if you gave most gamers the choice between the two titles, I feel that very few would select this one. It's a game which does what it needed to do without pushing itself far enough for such a late arrival on the system. With a surprising number of bike racing games on the console, I'd love to know which one is your personal favourite now that I've reviewed all of them. Be it this, Jeremy McGrath, Road Rash, Supercross 2000, Top Gear Hyperbike, heck you could even throw Extreme G into the mix if you wish. I'd love to know what you made of this game, especially from a multiplayer perspective, because I know that there are some fans of the soccer mode knocking around. So as always, sound off in the comments section down below, and until next time.